Good morning. It's so great to be here with you all. I'm Jamila Henderson. I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink. I largely work on our Bay Area Equity Atlas data tool. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my presentation and share my screen. Okay. So I'm joined today by my colleague, Abby Langston, who is also a senior associate at PolicyLink and who oversees our National Equity Atlas partnership. So with our time this morning, I'm going to share an overview of the Bay Area Equity Atlas and a live demo of the site. I will also briefly share the National Equity Atlas for those outside of the Bay Area. Please feel free to post questions during the presentation using the chat or the Q&A feature, whichever is available. And my colleague Abby can address those questions for you throughout the presentation. We will not have time following the presentation for questions. And then lastly, we would really appreciate it if you can complete the survey at the end, which helps us make these trainings as useful as possible. So jumping right in with a bit of background, the Bay Area Equity Atlas was developed through a partnership of the San Francisco Foundation, PolicyLink, and the USC Equity Research Institute, also known as ERI. And ERI and PolicyLink are actually longtime partners. We developed the National Equity Atlas together several years back. The Bay Area Equity Atlas is a relatively new tool and was launched in the summer of 2019. So we described the National Equity Atlas as America's most detailed report card on racial and economic equity. Through both the National Equity Atlas and Bay Area Equity Atlas data tools, we equip local leaders and policymakers with actionable data and strategies to advance racial equity and shared prosperity. The Bay Area Equity Atlas really draws from the National Equity Atlas, but is tailored to meet the needs of local leaders here in the 9-county region in the Bay Area in California. Although there is overlap across indicators in the tools, I'm thinking of demographics, homeownership, housing burden, income. The indicators included in the Bay Area Equity Atlas are driven by local leaders who use the data to advance their equity campaigns and who serve on the advisory committee for the Bay Area Equity Atlas. So what makes these tools unique? So the data for both of the tools are deeply disaggregated by race and ethnicity, gender, income, nativity, ancestry. You can layer the data in multiple ways, so you can view it in multiple ways. For example, you can explore rent burden by race and by poverty. In addition to the indicators, the atlas includes drivers of inequities, so providing that historical context behind the numbers so that it's clear what's really driving those differences, say in home ownership rates across race. And then we also include equity-focused policy solutions and examples. And the Bay Area Equity Atlas includes stories from residents experiencing housing insecurity or long commutes because they've been pushed further away from jobs due to rising housing costs. So that's just a little bit about the Bay Area Equity Atlas and National Equity Atlas tools. I'm going to transition to the live demo, and I'll start with the Bay Area Equity Atlas. Let me pull it up here. All right, here we are on the Bay Area Equity Atlas homepage. This is bayareaequityatlas.org. Although the site is very robust, we often discourage folks during these trainings from all joining at once, just so as not to overload the system. We don't want the indicators to load slowly for you all. So you may want to visit the site following the training. So here we are. This is the homepage of the Bay Area Equity Atlas, and we're highlighting here this people, place, and power framework of the San Francisco Foundation, who is our partner and funder in this work. And so this is really about removing barriers so that all can participate. That's people, live in healthy communities of opportunity, place, And then it's really about building community power and voice. And the goal is really to do that through the data available here on the Atlas. I would encourage you to check out the homepage when you have some time. This is where you'll find our analyses and data, how we've been supporting equity campaigns. So take some time. So when you have some time, it'd be great to check out the homepage. So I just want to share what's on the top menu here before diving into the indicators. So we have our indicators, which is really the driving force behind the Atlas. We conduct research, analyses, equity profiles, data snapshots, and fact sheets. I'll pull up the data snapshots first as an example. So with our data snapshots, we provide these pre-selected indicators for several geographies in the Atlas. The snapshots are a really great place to start if you aren't sure exactly what you want to explore. And they're available for several geographies for the region, county, and large cities. So let's take a look at the counties. We have the nine counties here in the Bay Area, maybe Santa Clara County. Just scrolling down here, we can see who lives in the region and who's fueling growth in terms of racial, ethnic composition. What does income inequality look like in Santa Clara County? Who is able to access high resource neighborhoods by race, ethnicity, and nativity? Who's rent burdened across race and gender? And then if renters were not burdened, how much more would they have to spend in disposable income? So I know I went through that quickly, and so I do encourage you to check this out on your own, but the snapshots are really great resources. And then I also want to share a fact sheet. So we have several fact sheets here. I will highlight Contra Costa County, which is one of the first eviction risk fact sheets that we produced. So in Contra Costa County, local movement leaders use the eviction risk fact sheet, which we co-created with them, to advocate for stronger renter protections early on in the pandemic. Many of these people or of these renters were largely people of color, lower income people who had disproportionately experienced jobs and income losses during the pandemic. And so these local leaders, it was the Raise a Roof Coalition in Contra Costa County, used this fact sheet to make the case to the Board of Supervisors for stronger renter protections. And the board unanimously passed an extension on the eviction moratorium and a freeze on rent increases. And this was in July of 2020. And so it was a temporary but important policy win at the time for renters at risk of losing their homes during the pandemic. And so this is the fact sheet. It's a one-pager or one-page front and back or two-page fact sheet. We also produced several fact sheets for other communities after producing this Contra Costa County fact sheet. We produced a fact sheet for the state, for California, and then for several other states across the country. We now have a rent debt dashboard available on the National Equity Atlas here that is regularly updated and that tracks the number of households behind on rent and at risk of eviction, the rent debt that they have collectively accumulated. And this is available for the nation, for states, for large metros, counties, and some select cities. So really a great resource on rent debt and eviction risk on the National Equity Atlas. Going back to the Bay Area Equity Atlas and our top menu here, we had looked at our research, data and action. This is where you can find our newsletters, see what we've been up to. You can sign up for our newsletters down at the bottom here, get Atlas updates. Under Help Center, I would encourage you to check out our FAQs. We have trainings and training exercises If you want to test your knowledge of the Bay Area and your skills using the Atlas, please check out the training exercise here. And then under About, I want to highlight our data. This is where you can learn more about the data and the methodology for creating these indicators. So speaking of indicators, we have 22 indicators on the site across 272 geographies in the Bay Area. So this includes the 2 regions, the 9-county Bay Area region and the 5-county region, the smaller 5-county region within that. It includes the individual 9 counties, 6 large cities, including Antioch, Fremont, Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, and Sunnyvale. So there's going to be more data available for those larger cities. But then we also provide data for over 200 other places. So these are small and mid-sized cities and unincorporated areas. California is included as a comparison geography for some of the indicators. And then most indicators have been updated to reflect the most recent 2019 American Community Survey data. Okay, so let's jump right into the indicators. I'm going to share race and ethnicity, which is a great place to start when you're first learning about a community, to see who lives there and who's really fueling growth. So I'll walk through the elements that you'll find on every indicators page, and I'll start with this wraparound text here. So at the top here, we have this framing statement. Nurturing diversity and increasing equity are critical to our region's future. This is our framing statement, which really explains why this indicator is important, why we're tracking it over time, and how it relates to racial or economic equity. Skipping over the display for just a moment, I want to highlight the text below. We have insights and analyses, which describe some high-level trends for the region that it's helpful context to use to compare to your community, for example. We include relevant analyses here. We have drivers of demographic shifts. This was something we added with the Bay Area Equity Atlas. And so for this particular indicator, looking at demographics, we have drivers of demographic shifts. For the other indicators, we have drivers of inequities to really provide that historical context and background for what's driving these numbers. Why are we seeing these differences across race, across gender, ancestry, for example? And then this is not only a data tool, it's a policy tool. So we include strategies to help address some of these indicators, many of which come from local leaders and partners. We include a strategy in action, which is really an example of how one community has used these strategies in practice. So this is a cultural preservation district in San Francisco's Soma neighborhood. It focuses on cultural diversity and preservation. These examples do change for each of the indicators. And then we have these resident stories on the Bay Area Equity Atlas. And we really want to continue to build these out. They're available for some of the indicators, and it really helps to put a face to the numbers and to show how these are real issues that affect real people. Excuse me. And then we also provide other resources outside the Bay Area Equity Atlas that we really want to lift up as well. Okay, so going back to our display, I want to highlight this question mark here, which is often overlooked. So this provides a definition. It just includes the years that are included. And if you click on Learn More, that'll take you to the methodology that I mentioned earlier. You can also find a lot of the information here, as well as a source below the chart. And so what are we actually looking at here? So this is the racial and ethnic composition over time. It includes projections through 2050, and this is for the 9-county region. And projections data are available for counties and above, and only for this indicator. But what it's telling us is that the Latinx or Latino population in blue and the Asian or Pacific Islander population in green are really fueling growth and have grown as a share of the total population over time. Whereas the white population is declining as a share of the population here in gray. Other groups such as the Black population, Native American population, and multiracial population have remained relatively stable over this time period, at least at the regional level. But when we really start to dig down into cities and counties, we see different shifts and declines, particularly in the Black population, for example, from core cities like San Francisco and Oakland, because of people either being pushed out because of lack of affordable housing, for example, or voluntarily kind of relocating to suburban communities. Antioch comes to mind, and of course, other reasons for seeing some of those shifts below the regional level. And then I want to highlight the breakdown here. This is where you can kind of cut the data, slice the data in a number of different ways. This breakdown will change depending on the indicator and your geography. Also we can make this display full screen, which is really helpful during presentations. You can share on social media or by email. Download the data, the image or a PowerPoint of this image or the data behind the display. Go ahead and minimize. And then I don't want to forget these last few pieces below the display, these tabs, what it shows. So this really tells you exactly what you're looking at. And this text here is dynamic. So between 2000 and 2019, the white population changed from 50% to 39% in the region. But, so if we were to change our breakdown or our geography, this text would update to reflect that because it's dynamic text. So I had mentioned Antioch earlier, which is a large city. Let's take a, in the atlas, take a look at Antioch. Well, one, we see our projections data went away. It's not available for cities, but we can also see this, our text has updated to reflect the city of Antioch. And we're seeing a different trend here, especially for the Black population than we saw region-wide. In 2000, Black residents accounted for 9% of the population in Antioch, and by 2019, it was 21%, nearly double. So this trend looks quite different than the region, and is different than in where we're seeing a loss of Black population in places like Oakland and San Francisco. We have this other tab here, why it matters. And this is really an expansion of that framing statement at the top that describes why this indicator is important, why we're tracking it over time, how it advances racial and economic equity. So really an expansion of this sentence here. And then lastly, this is new, and I think it's just available for the race ethnicity indicator, the kind of the first indicator in the list. A tour of the displays in case you get stuck or need help navigating the tool here. And this really is very similar to what I just went over. So I won't go over it again, but wanted you to be aware that it is here. Okay, let's take a look at another indicator on the Bay Area Equity Atlas. You could choose your indicators here with the indicator group and selection there, or up top where you can see everything at the same time. So this next indicator is housing burden, and housing burden is, I'm going to go back to the region. Housing burden is defined as spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs, whether that's your mortgage or your rent. Here, it's defaulted to renters. So we're looking at rent burden, the share of households, renters that are burdened. But we could look at owners, by changing the tenure filter. Wow. And so these households are really paying unaffordable rents. And housing costs are, generally a household's greatest expense. In the Bay Area, it's really not uncommon for households to be spending more than half of their income on housing costs, and that's severely rent burdened. And we can change the severity level here, severely burdened to burdened. I also want to highlight this compare feature here, which is available for the housing burden indicator. So we would have our selection geography. Here it's the 9-county Bay Area region in orange. See the legend here. And if you select the compare tab, then you could compare to another geography. Right now we're looking at data across the state, and we can keep those defaults for now. So what we're seeing is that the share of renters that are rent burdened is increasing in the region, or was increasing in the region and in the state early on, and then kind of leveled off or declined. But that there's a higher share of renters that are burdened statewide as compared to the region. And that was somewhat surprising to me, given the high housing costs here in the Bay Area. But because rent burden is a function of your income and housing costs, somehow high cost areas like the Bay Area, where there is a high concentration of higher income people, may have a relatively lower share of rent burdened residents compared to the state as a whole. Okay, so that's the compare feature. And then we have our breakdowns, like you saw with the other indicator, but there are a lot more options here. This may be the most breakdowns that you'll see for any one indicator on the Bay Area Equity Atlas. So let's take a look. Let's drill down by race and gender. And so here we're looking at the share of renters in the region that are burdened by race and ethnicity. And we can see that Black women are most likely to be rent burdened, followed by Latinas. We could also break down the data by ancestry. Here we have the Asian or Pacific Islander population in green, and we know that this is a very diverse group here in the Bay Area and is often kind of lumped together. But by really drilling down into this group, we're able to see differences across this group that we wouldn't be able to see without disaggregating by ancestry. And there are some stark differences here. For example, 59% of Vietnamese renters are burdened. You see that varies across other groups. So a really powerful breakdown here with the ancestry breakdown. Okay, one more indicator on the Bay Area Equity Atlas, home ownership. So this is actually the newest indicator on the Bay Area Equity Atlas, which is pretty exciting. We will also be releasing an indicator on employment, so stay tuned for that. And we haven't looked at a map yet. So if you go to breakdown and map, that's where you can find the maps under breakdown. Not all of the indicators have a map breakdown, but many of them do. We had been selecting our geography kind of outside the window here, but once we are looking at a map, we select our geography here. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen. I think it's really interesting to drill down into neighborhoods or tracts. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And then once I hover over the map, I'm able to look at the data. So the areas that are in the kind of blue-green color are areas with higher rates of homeownership, and those in the yellow or orange are the areas with lower homeownership rates. And so we're seeing some differences here across the region. We could filter the data across years. But what's really unique, I think, about the map breakdown for some of the indicators is this map filters feature. And so this allows you to filter the map by demographic group. So by education level, for example, but let's say we're interested in looking at, largely communities of color. And we would use this slider here to filter the map for that population. So let's say 75%. So we're still looking at home ownership rates, but we are only looking at neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color, where people of color make up 75% of the neighborhood. And so we're seeing some pretty low home ownership rates across the region, 23%, go down to 14% in parts of San Jose. And on the flip side of that, let's say we want to look at predominantly communities that are predominantly white. And we're seeing a different trend. I mean, it highlights kind of segregation in the region, but also we can see that communities that are neighborhoods that are predominantly white tend to have higher home ownership rates. 63%, 64%. It is lower here. San Francisco, a lot of renters in San Francisco. So that is the map filters feature, which is a really helpful tool if there are specific populations you are working with or neighborhoods of interest. I could see how this feature could be helpful in thinking of recovery efforts from the pandemic and focusing on specific communities. So this would be pre-pandemic data, but you could look at these pre-COVID neighborhood characteristics like that get at language barriers. We have a linguistic isolation indicator on the Bay Area Equity Atlas, or if you're focusing on, vaccine rollout for hard to reach populations, using, the map filters feature could get at some of those areas where specific demographic groups may be concentrated. Okay, so I'm going to share one more indicator, but on the National Equity Atlas. Educational attainment. Educational attainment is available on the Bay Area Equity Atlas, although there are more breakdown options available on the National Equity Atlas. So I should note that the National Equity Atlas contains data on demographic change, racial and economic inclusion, the potential economic gains from racial equity. And this data is available for the 100 largest cities in the country, the 150 largest metros, all 50 states and the United States. And then we just recently added data for large counties. So that's also a new geography that's available on the National Equity Atlas. So let's take a look at a community or a city outside the Bay Area. For folks who may not be in the Bay Area region, how about Sacramento? And let's drill down by ancestry. So the default here is adults with a bachelor's degree or higher, and we're looking at the Asian or Pacific Islander population adults in Sacramento. And we are seeing some pretty large differences in the share that hold at least a bachelor's degree. We could look at a different educational level, a high school diploma, for example. We could look across different racial and ethnic groups by nativity. We could change the year. So a lot of ways to really explore and drill down into the data using the Bay Area Equity Atlas and National Equity Atlas tools. So I'm actually going to stop there because this was meant to really give you just a quick introduction to the National Equity Atlas and Bay Area Equity Atlas tools. I hope that we were able to answer your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. If you have additional questions, our contact information is listed here. If you have a moment, we would really appreciate you completing our evaluation. This really helps us make these trainings as useful as possible. The link is here and hopefully also shared in the chat. And I just thank you for your time and your participation. Thanks so much.